Hello everyone, today we talk about the Frisian Kingdom in West Frisian Friske Keninkrijke, also known as Magna Frisia, which is actually the modern name, and actually kingdom is a big word in this context as we will see, for a post-Roman Frisian realm during the period of its largest extent, at least as a political territorial reality. So we're roughly between the mid-7th and the beginning of the 8th century. It emerged as a power fundamentally, in fact, in the same beginning of the same period, and was put down as, at least as in fact, as an independent polity. As we will see, there would be a lot of rebellions afterward, but still, after the Battle of the Boorne River, in fact, in the final year 734, as the Frisians were defeated by the Frankish Empire, and more specifically by the emerging Pepin Arnulfing dynasty. More of this later. Frisia had, in fact, as we will see, participated in a sense to the Frankish games of power, and specifically in the rivalry that opposed the majordome of Neustria to the one of Austrasia. And if you look at the map, Frisia is just basically over them and stretching from mostly, yes, as a crescent from southwest to northeast, bordering Saxony, by the way. So the Frisians would actually join also Widokind's rebellion and paid accordingly under Charlemagne. So the resilience of these people is interesting because it shows that the Frisians were probably, if they hadn't been checked by the recompacting Frankish power, probably emerged as some sort of also kind of more consistent reality than they were, probably because of this enormous of the general European revival of the 8th century in part, but also their key political and strategical location at the mouth of the Rhine River. And you know that the Franks fundamentally had an enormous network going on across the river. The Upper Rhine was also the center of arms and armor production in Europe at the time that were exported increasingly in the North Sea. At this point was known, at least in part, as Oceanus Frisonicus, right? Because the Frisians were also pirates, and for an important amount of time had enjoyed, in fact, this preeminence in the region. At the point somebody says, the Vikings emerged just later because the Franks crushed the Frisian piracy and left this gap to be filled by Scandinavians. Well, that's a bit too much to say. That's surely not a decisive factor in triggering the Viking expansion. But and in fact, it's more accurate to think of the Frisians as part of that broader network, not just with Scandinavia, but also with the Anglo-Saxons, and so just being immediately projected because of obviously the geographical position on the sea, and that kind of network. And let's say piracy in the area had always existed since late Roman times, albeit there is a debate, as we'll see now, also in the continuity between the ancient Frisi and the Frisians, the latter which seem to have been more akin to, in fact, to the Angles, to the Utes, to the Saxons, rather than to the ancient population, the one that interacted mostly with the Romans. And it's important in a sense to stress that this was a post-Roman reality, because great part of the attrition between the Frisians and the Franks would derive, in fact, from the struggle, the competition on the control of the former Roman fortresses across the Rhine, the Mons, right? And in fact, some of the most important cities, such as Utrecht, Trajectum, were considered some of the most important areas. Also, Dorestad, that is one of those cities that fundamentally disappeared and enjoyed a great prominence during the Viking era, but it was more like a commercial center. It also had a mint at some point in Frisian times. Let's say that we don't know so much about the extent of Frisian power, nor about the nature of their government. Right, in 19th century Netherlands, there was some sort of revival of the interest for national reasons about the interest towards the Frisians, that brought to fundamentally a speculation that their polity would stretch from the Zwin near Brugge in Belgium to the Weser in Germany, and near Bremen fundamentally. And these other centers, there were several at the time. There was not really a capital, right? The name used in the medieval accounts is normally just Frisia in Latin, and there is no actual evidence for the existence of a permanent central authority. It probably consisted of petty kingdoms that were in part competing with one another, as well as with external forces, and especially with the Franks, that were at some point the greatest threat to Frisian independence, as effectively this would be put down by the Carolingians. So, in a way, that metus hostilis would bring to a compaction of Frisian political intent around some single figures that can be considered as monarchs, as a matter of fact. In fact, the contemporary accounts speak of duces and reges, not really pointing at a single overlord, right? And the Frisians were still living great part in this very poor and primitive area of Europe still, however, with this important traditional mindset about the the magic, religious, military nature of power, right? For which a single rulers were mostly such by example, right? As at least this is what Tacitus says about the early Frisi, right? And not much probably changed in early medieval times, in spite of the, as we will see now, people's movements, etc. So there were quite warlike populations that also didn't have much other chance but to be so in order to survive, and therefore posing an actual threat, right, or at least some resistance to be reckoned with to the Merovingians, to the Carolingians. But if you just look at the map, I don't think there is any concrete estimate of how many Frisians lived in terms of proper manpower, but we're just a very little thing, right? And just next door to the major European power of the time, Western Europe at least. And so the proximity doesn't mean much, because this area is also in medieval times would, as you know, escape decentralization both of France and of Germany, remain kind of something on their own. Still, in that spirit you can't find in the Netherlands, still to modern times and beyond. And so peoples that with relentless effort managed to accumulate eventually in the second modern age an enormous quantity of wealth, making the Netherlands one of the few actually rich countries in the world, and that bears that kind of independent mindset that you could find already from this time onwards, right? And also before them, as you know, these were areas from which the Romans drew some of their toughest auxiliary forces, especially infantry, because fundamentally the southern, it's a bit difficult to qualify them. They're Western Germans fundamentally, but there is in fact a lot in common with the Scandinavians, especially in the early medieval times, where didn't have much of an equestrian culture, at least from a structural point of view, right? Of course, they had cavalry, but there is no evidence of feudal system, without which you can't really have a strong heavy cavalry. And so this is interesting because it shows repeatedly, not just in, I don't know, Frankish times, but also later on. Think about the Frisian resistance to surrounding feudal powers in the 14th century on infantry, right? And this properly popular, still kind of ancient Zippe kind of like of political cohesion. Albeit, of course, at this time, it was the comitatus that probably really, as always, made these reges, these petty kings, that based their power essentially on their retinues and their war bands, but altogether wouldn't have, in fact, a major, political position in the region, right? They were mostly a local power. They were limited to that, but they would know how to defend their own territory, which, speaking of terrain, as you know, is quite difficult because it's full of rivers, of islets, of at the time, especially of swamps. Many areas were claimed back from the sea, as you know, in later medieval times and in the modern, even contemporary era. And so, even for a remarkably developed army, like it would be already the Merovingian and later the Carolingian one, that counted importantly on heavy cavalry, these weren't easy terrains, right, to venture in. Still, so the Frisians could exploit that in a defensive fashion. As we will see, they also participated properly in the Frankish hinterland to some military operations. Next, in that case, however, to some larger Frankish forces, but were even able of defeating the Franks, including Charles Martel. At some point was crushed with his army by a Frisian one. And that represents one of the very few defeats that Charles underwent. Right, so this is particularly important. Eventually, the Franks, however, were the stronger power and would manage to subjugate them for good. So, as we were saying before, speaking of the pre-migration era, the ancient Frisi lived in the Netherlands, in fact, of the comprehended between the Zuiderzee and the river Ems. And there was surely an ethnic similarity between the Frisi, the Cauci, the Saxons, the Angles that inhabited the continental European coast from the Zuiderzee to the Jutland Peninsula. And notoriously enough, all these peoples shared a common material culture, so they cannot be distinguished practically from an archaeological point of view. We just have to rely on the Roman accounts to know who was who there, because effectively they were quite primitively homogeneous. And in fact, the few we know about the Frisi specifically comes from the Roman account about Malorix and Verritus, these two Frisian chieftains that visited Rome in the 1st century AD. And there's been some speculation regarding, mostly triggered by the absence of further information in late antiquity about the Frisi, that revolves around the idea that for some reason these lands went depopulated. Either the Frisi moved or they became something else, or they migrated. Naturally, the area remains inhabited all the way through this period, as archaeology shows. So, of course, there are hardly radical events in these areas, in spite of all the wars, the movements, and even natural disasters. In fact, the major, let's say, factor that may have caused a consistent depopulation of the area is the marine transgression that Frisia suffered consistently. And in fact, exactly during the 3rd and the 5th century, it seems, that may have largely caused large depopulation, as you can understand. So there would have been a wave of peoples only from the 6th century settling again in large number in the area. In fact, the same populations that pushed west and crossed the same North Sea in the same Britain. So we're talking about the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, that in fact would maintain important connections and cultural proximity in general with the Frisians, in fact, that kept being called like this because of the name of the ancient reason, but that were not necessarily at least in an important part, the original descendants of the ancient Frisi. And the connection with Anglo-Saxon England and also, broadly speaking, the northern world, the sagas, etc., comes from the episode of the King Finn associated with the Battle of Finnsburg. So in the story there are some evidences also from Beowulf, and we understand philologically that the history was famous. The story was famous in the northern world, so that these Frisians were important and considered. The young Danish prince Gnef, as he had been invited as a guest of the Frisian king Finn, was killed essentially in a battle that had broken out between the two parties, probably started by the Frisian one. So as always, the stories are always in this kind of heroic epos and proto-chivalric fashion, for which, these heroes are always kind of inviting each other and making deals, etc. But for some reason, somebody screws up, because of the morals or misunderstanding this tragic destiny of the world, the Germanic mindset, and there is a bloody battle. This one also is very much in line with the, even Nibelungenlied style, with the siege in the Great Hall, the massacre, all these things. And the Frisians, however, managed to kill Gnef, and Gnef's retainer, that is Hengist, that was in fact together with Horsa, as you know, one of the first leaders to factually settle in Britain, right, from the continent with their retinues, initially called there probably by the Romano-Britons, and eventually taking over with the Anglo-Saxon migrations, becoming ever more consistent, took command of the Danish retinue. The two sides actually signed a peace treaty, we could say, but Hengist and the Danes later avenged Gnef's death by slaughtering the Frisians. So this interaction is interesting, because it shows again a Frisian relevance in the political balance of the times. Also, an early historical king of the Frisians is Aldolf, that we know because he minted coins dating to the first third of the 7th century, so also showing a certain importance. Consider, as we were saying before, that there were these Roman centers that peoples had eventually settled in, and these were not some of the most prosperous post-Roman areas, but still had an important strategic military nature, right, on the Rhine frontier, etc. So there were, like in the case of the Franks, were also the Salians were and the Ripuarians were somewhat close, both to the area, had maintained this kind of lordships on various pre-existing centers, which they had exploited the infrastructures, etc. And again, they controlled important trade routes that the Franks would have eventually wanted to control, stripping them away from the Frisians, which they subdued in the process. And as we were saying before, that doesn't seem to have been important political cohesion among the Frisian tribes right? They didn't have individually much power per se. And so when we talk about kingship, we're actually looking at these various, this loose cooperation, right? Not really the presence of a monarchy or a dynasty that managed to literally control the entire region. And the earliest Frisian records name also the typical 4 social classes in Europe at the time, in Germanic Europe fundamentally: the Aethelings, so the noblemen, nobiles in Latin; the Freelings, that were fundamentally free men and that could make up the bulk, probably the Frisian people. They could bring suit at court. They probably had an important power in the political and social balance because, as we were saying before, these people were very poorly stratified. So the freemen were really, they probably had in some areas, especially the upper hand over the nobility, as they would keep having, right, even against, literally feudal dynasties in the High Middle Ages by a certain degree at least. Then there were the Latin or Letan that were some sort of serfs, right, so half freemen, and then properly the slaves. Slave trade was just the most lucrative and, in fact, aimed at activity, especially for a people of pirates. And slavery, however, like very slowly, like in old medieval Europe, would gradually transform into something more like serfdom. In fact, the slaves would be assimilated to the Latin elite, which were essentially people living on land that was not their own, and so this made them formally, like, in fact, half free. They were. It's even a mistake in traditional cultures to present that there is an exact boundary that we can't categorize on. The same fact that they depended on somebody else in these essentially mob-dominated world was enough to say, your freedom is less than somebody else's. And so this was a typical reality of the time. Now, we know of very few kings historically that whose, say, reign can be documented, and this happens to be in relation of the war with the Franks. Unavoidably, that instead had a much better documented history, and therefore every time they encountered the Frisians, they, for some important reason, they were telling what was going on. We have a general understanding that, as even the Anglo-Saxons across the Channel, the Frisians were under some clientery/vassalage condition with the Merovingians, which was obvious because Frankish power was immense, right? And even though it was significantly crippled by the feuds between within the royal dynasties that broke down the Frankish kingdom and power effectively in 4 different chunks, the surrounding people, especially a minor one like the Frisians, would always gravitate around, would always be in the orbit within the sphere of Frankish power, but also being able, in fact, is seizing the opportunities that arose from such fragmentation. There are some Merovingian kings that styled themselves as, Scourge of the Frisians and of the Suebi, or things like these. Because, indeed, frontier warfare was normal at the time, was like part of the normal political dialectic, so it was normal every once in a while to go raiding and, suffering raids and tit-for-tat policy and strategy that the Franks, think about the relation with the Saxons, were pretty much the same thing. And it was in many ways the best way also to cash, right, through loot very often, and so war is hardly the better option most of the times. But in those times, like if you didn't loot, right, you could lose important opportunities. You may have properly run out of power and being subdued by somebody else. So the question was much more natural than today, politically wise. So under the rule of the king Aldegisel, the Frisians fought against the Frankish mayor of the palace, Ebroin of Neustria. I was, in fact, in charge for first between 658 673 and eventually from 675 to his death in 680 or 81 as such. And Aldegisel was at that time sponsoring Christian missionaries in Frisia. Apparently not because, as you will see now, the Frisians were particularly interested, not Aldegisel specifically, in the evangelization of their people, but to make an affront to the same Ebroin, because Wilfrid, that had been in Francia and had been involved politically at a local level, was hated by Ebroin, so much that the latter offered the same Aldegisel, while Wilfrid was at the Frisian court, a bushel of gold coins in return for the same Wilfrid, alive or dead. And Aldegisel, on this occasion, is said to have torn up and burned the letter from the Frankish mayor in front of the ambassadors and his household, which equated to the political declaration, an international shout-out against Ebroin as a corrupter and a man of nothing, right? If you are, this is the mentality of the time. If you are really a man, you should be able to get what you want without bribing anybody. And probably, in fact, Aldegisel didn't give a damn about Wilfrid himself, but that's an interesting look at how some Christianity penetrated these cultures. And during his stay, however, Wilfrid attempted to convert the Frisians, who were still, in fact, pagan at the time. There doesn't seem to have been any, significant, relevant Christianization. Of course, there were some Christian Frisians already, but the land was so, in fact, say, primitive and framed properly in some more like a northern circuit than a continental one, that in the same Frisian independence was, in a sense, ideologically marked by, say, if the main threat are the Franks and those are Christians, we are going to stay pagan, right? But it was properly the politics in the society that wouldn't, say, make the Frisians afford at that point a stable Christianization, because the elites were too weak, probably, and so they couldn't engineer this, for example, the foundation of monasteries and investing in those assets, because they didn't have one. And their better defense at that point was more like a political cohesion and a military capacity, or likeness more broadly. And yet, perhaps exactly because of not just Aldegisel's, but also the Frisian nobility altogether, adversity towards Ebroin, and so Neustria was a hell of a power just next door. At least Wilfrid's biographer says that most Frisian noblemen converted to Christianity, which is interesting because, again, it's the nobility. So you see, it's always the same pattern as it would happen among all the Christianization of Europe. It's the elite that starts that, right? So, but the success was short-lived anyway, because, again, it was probably just, formality. And also in a pagan mindset, if you have yet another god from your side is okay. And naturally, we don't have to think the Frisian nobility understood much of theology in the first place, so it was perfectly fine with them, right? Their pagan cults were still there. Nobody at this point was taking them away, and it was just a political opportunity, let's say. Aldegisel died in 680, and he was succeeded, as we've seen, this monarch, at least big word, but as a preeminent, maybe hegemonic even, Frisian lord, in fact, by his son Radbod. Now, as we've seen, Aldegisel had somewhat welcomed formally Christianity in Frisia, whereas Radbod, as we'll see, would always remain quite adverse to the idea, right? As also the same Frankish policy was changing, and Radbod essentially attempted to extirpate Christianity altogether from the previous times, which was in fact already showing how the Merovingians were, infiltrating in the process in Frisian policy, and he would be defeated for this reason by Pepin of Herstal, right? So the ancestor of the Carolingians in the Battle of Dorestad, so much that Radbod was compelled also to cede Frisia Citerior, so the so-called Near Frisia from the Frankish perspective. This is essentially the area of Frisia between the Scheldt to the Vlie River, to the same Franks. The Battle of Dorestad was fought in 690. These medieval battles in general, as the ancient ones, were fought because of the proximity of a city was besieged, and so an army arrived to relieve it, and the two sides gave battle. As we were saying before, the Franks were mostly interested in the trade centers, right, on the major waterways, for their control of the North Sea traffics, and it was easier simply to occupy these strongholds and essentially leaving the poorer local communities alone, right? Given that at that point they would have been simply absorbed through some kind of cultural osmosis to trade and etc. It was not so simple, as the Franks would find out. Naturally, given the times and places, we know nothing tactically wise about these battles. It's already something if we know anything tactical from Carolingian times, late Carolingian times. In any case, Dorestad and Utrecht, as a consequence of the Battle of Dorestad, fell in the hands of Pepin of Herstal, which scored thus a very big hit on these important trade routes on the Rhine and the North Sea. And at this point, Radbod is said to have retreated either to the island of Heligoland or, by the way, on perhaps eastern Frisia. Was the poorer one, the western Frisia was the more developed, as we've seen, for obvious reasons, and kind of hiding, right, from Frankish power. Now, at this point, Willibrord, that had been a pupil of Wilfrid, was sent by the Franks, by the church, to Christianize the pagan Frisians, given that, as we've seen, this important strongholds had been captured, and so there was some hope to start some broader process of assimilation, also from a religious point of view. Consider that Pepin at this point had nominal suzerainty over the region, so he fully disposed and controlled these movements, in coordination also with the papacy, because the very old ties of the Frankish church with the Roman one, so much that on November the 21st, 695, Pope Sergius I gave Willibrord a pallium, consecrating him bishop of the Frisians. In fact, at this point, Willibrord went to Frisia. Actually, he had to flee because of Radbod's persecution, as again there were some missionaries from Aldegisel's time in the land, and Willibrord preached and also established churches, among them a monastery at Utrecht, where in the same place, in fact, where the city dome that stands today, the cathedral would be built. So this made Willibrord traditionally the first bishop of Utrecht, and so an important figure in the Christianization of the Netherlands. And we don't know exactly up to which, say how far Frankish control stretched in Frisian lands. Some think that they reached south of the Oude Rijn, or to the coast. But again, this is not entirely clear. So first of all, because the areas were quite fragmented also territorially, but all these, the waterways, etc. So it probably was not easy to control those specifically, and the Frisians were all around, so they were not surely mild communities to coerce for the control of the land, so much that the Frankish dominion was still unstable on the area at this time, at the point that Pepin arranged a political marriage between his oldest son, Grimoald the Younger, and Thiadswind, who was the daughter of Radbod. This happened in 711. Of course, this was a form of also cooptation, the same Frisian aristocracy, but there was quite of a distrust, especially after this foreign occupant had settled in the land. Now, Pepin of Herstal died in 714, which caused a vacuum of power exploited by Radbod, who essentially regained control of southern Frisia and made a treaty with the Neustrian majordom Ragnfrid against Austrasia. That was the homeland of the Pepinids, and that at this point had been thrown in turmoil, so much that in 716 the king of the Franks, Chilperic II, still of course the Merovingians, and Ragnfrid, the majordom of Neustria, invaded the same Austrasia, where essentially were two factions there that still were competing after Pepin's death. There was the one of Theodoald and Pelktrude, who were respectively Pepin's heir and grandson specifically, and widow, and those of Charles Martel, illegitimate of Pepin, that should have probably not even considered that much by his father as a successor, and that instead would become, as you know, one of the most important figures in Western history. And Charles Martel was not in an easy situation, because he had at this point just escaped from Pelktrude's prison in Cologne. That was more or less the area where the Pepinids Arnulfings had coalesced their own power, and had been, however, acclaimed Major of the Palace of Austrasia, as was seen as factually the only legitimate heir, actually, Pepin, as he was already, an important leader of men and had a political this active political support, especially in such a bad situation when the Neustrians were invading their own land. Now, Radbod of Frisia invaded Austrasia at the same time. Also, the Christians were overthrown from Frisia. Saint Willibrord and his monks fled the land, and he allied himself with Chilperic and the Neustrians. And importantly enough, in Frisian military history, outside of Cologne, that was being besieged by the Austrians and held by Plectrude at that point, Charles Martel was defeated by Radbod's Frisian army and forced to flee to the Eifel Mountains. This was an important step because Cologne would actually fall after a short siege to King Chilperic and the Frisians and the Austrians. And Charles, in the mountains of the Eifel, gathered consensus among the Austrasian nobility that in part had, distrusted him as long as naturally he was the next leader that could kind of curb its own autonomy. But in that moment of extreme danger, they sided with him. Charles rallied his supporters, and he managed to defeat the army of Chilperic II and of his allies, the Austrians, the Frisians, at Ambleve, near Amel, by ambushing them as they were returning triumphantly from Cologne. This battle instead is somewhat loosely known from a tactical point of view. Charles used a feint retreat, right, to attract the enemy on a more favorable ground for the Austrasians, where probably he came out catching the enemy by surprise with his main force and defeating the enemy, and also devastating the Frisian army in the process. So here we're witnessing not just a great commander and ruler, and charismatic leader, but also the important force of a civilization that the Franks were engineering further, and that Charles Martel's descendants, especially him, he started that importantly when he would retake, in fact, control of the whole Francia. But already this important flexibility provided by cavalry, right? Infantry was still very important at this point, but having a broader vision of something more complex, a greater collective training, etc. We can expect the Frisians, for example, not to have enjoyed kind of the same thing. He may have been kind of bolder and strong, more resistant, and more individually driven. But the collective level, they may have actually lacked that degree of complexity that the same Frankish armies were enjoying. In any case, we don't know how it went for that matter. Really, what was the factor, we never know. As Clausewitzians, we know that we can't fully know how a battle is fought, not even if we are there, or if historians study it for a very long time. But it's possible to interpret these important moments, if anything, because they were the ones to trigger the rise of the main figures that we know in the West, of Charles Martel, etc., as connected also to these military cultural differences. Charles Martel had, by the way, taken under his wing the same Willibrord and Boniface, an Anglo-Saxon bishop who had joined him and who had spent time in Frisia attempting to convert the locals to Christianity, and that had to leave the land after Radbod had retaken possession of it after the death of Pepin Herstal, and after having in fact killed many missionaries and destroyed churches, having burned them down. So the Frisian army actually managed to return to the north even after the defeat, with an important loot that they had gathered here and there, and this allowed Radbod to make plans to invade Francia again. And this is kind of interesting because it shows again how even an important reversal. First of all, Radbod had survived himself. That was an important thing. And the Franks were scared of him, right? Chronicles say that there was terror spread among the Franks when it was known that Radbod had managed to mobilize yet again a large army, which speaks also probably of the demographic strength of the Frisians at this point. As again, these as we were saying before, that this northern peoples at the time were kind of reactivating, and also from an economical point of view, from a demographic point of view, but very often they would be ever more warlike, a bit like the Scandinavians would turn into Vikings as a profession, because they were anxious to loot ever more for the amount of people that were beginning to populate, to become ever more dense in the land, and needed more resources. And so there's this pressure, right, that brings these people to be ever more aggressive in a way, and to be ever better organized, right? So that's why we know about these Frisian kings, because they were becoming probably ever more powerful, also from a for this concerted moral and material effort that the people was able to make in order to simply expand, to overflow boundaries, in search of new land, etc. But Radbod died of illness in 719 before he could enact his military plans in Francia. And we don't even know by whom he was succeeded. Probably there were troubles with the succession, because at that point Charles Martel easily invaded and subjugated Frisia, which speaks definitely of lack of political cohesion in front of the invader. Surely, Charles' victory at Ambleve was not a light blow to the same Frisian manpower, let's say. But as we were just saying, the country was willing to, come back and capable of coming back on its feet. So it's more likely that Radbod's death, and that also had brought the Frisians into quite dangerous game, was probably a moment where other factions tried to, even to stop, and probably had taken, made agreements with the same Franks for invading the land and being co-opted in the administration, etc. And Frisia, in fact, was so weak at this point that Charles Martel not only annexed the aforementioned Frisia Citerior, so the one that the Franks had, or that his father had already occupied, so the Frisia south of the Rhine, but also the ulterior one, the Frisia ulterior, so the farther, to the banks of the river Vley. And at this point also the Christian missionaries came back in Frisia, Willibrord, Boniface, etc. There was a rebellion in 733, which Charles Martel put down again. So this marks a bit the the end, as we've seen, of Frisian independence for good. Probably this attempt of reviving Frisian resistance just showed at that point the aforementioned fragility of the political institutional structures of the land compared to now a very much revived Frankish power. I mean, Charles Martel just the year before had defeated the Arabs at Poitiers and had incorporated within the Carolingian possession in the entire Aquitaine, right? So these were big gains. I mean, Frisia in comparison really couldn't be on the fore. But again, as we will see, revolts didn't end. So showing again some innate force of the Frisians that really took a while to extinguish for good. In 733-34, the Frisians gave hostages to the Franks, converted to Christianity formally, and also recognized Carolingian overlordship. And there was surely some cooperation with the Franks, so much that when Charles left after the repression, also some Frisians punished other Frisians because of this yet another very heavy repression that they had to suffer at the hand of the Franks, because some of their fellow connationals had decided probably not a very sensible way to take up arms again, probably against their own the consensus of another of the other side of the people. But again, there was another rebellion in the same 734 under another leader, another king, Poppo. And Charles Martel, at this point, also took some important logistical measures. He put together a large fleet, which ferried an army across the Almere River for a naval invasion. And this was aimed at properly landing on Westergo and Ostergo, encountering no resistance. So we're talking about these, the part of the 7 sea lands, right, that were to be reached properly by ship, because that's where also the Frisians would entrench themselves, protecting themselves surrounded by waters. And there's also an interesting operational theater if you think about it, given that the Franks were also not much of a maritime power themselves, but they, were ingenious enough, especially after such a great organizer like Charles. And on these lands, Charles met no resistance, so much that there was actually no punishment against the Frisians, because probably the Franks understood that further violence would have exacerbated further the conflict. It was easier to show that, any resistance was futile in the first place. Like, what the hell are you doing, right? Cut it off with this. Now, however, Poppo's force was determined to meet with the Franks in battle. So much that this happened across the river Boorne, where the Frankish army was, along which the Frankish army was moving, perhaps towards Aldolf. That was one of the most important commercial centers of Frisia at the time, so where the Franks were probably heading, if we want to find a strategic motive there. And this, Aldolf is between Domburg and Dorestad, right? So an important trade flow passed through it. Now, the Frisians, we don't know much about their forces, again, their organization, but we can probably see that they made up this kind of desperate counterattack, trying to take by surprise the Franks, because Poppo commanded his army to use boats to land their army on the other bank of the river, so to catch the Franks by surprise. But the Franks, and here it's the advancement of civilization, were also, well organized. They had fortified their encampment. So the Frisians probably showed off their amphibious capacities that, as seamen, surely knew how to enact. But once they landed on the shore, the Franks defeated them. In fact, at the Battle of the Boorne in 734, formally, at least traditionally, bringing Frisian independence to an end for good, right? So probably even in here we can see, yes, this kind of romantic / heroic resistance by an already subjugated people that is imposed a foreign rule, a forced conversion, etc. But still, as they had lost before, they would lose again against, in fact, a greater power had managed to impose itself there, also with some sound basis. And so we can imagine, just stereotypically, it's pure speculation, but again, mainly, yes, maybe amphibiously skilled and also kind of determined, mostly infantry-based Frisian army being outmaneuvered and probably also outpowered in terms especially of cavalry charges that the Carolingians there were really beginning to hit very hard with. The Arabs a couple of years ago had known something about that. To and being mopped up eventually by the Franks, right? And consider that, again, when you have to cross a river and that from the other side you've left everything and you're landing there for, it's either you win or you die, right? You have nowhere else to retreat. And in fact, Poppo was killed in combat, and the remains of his army were pushed back to Istergoa. Poppo's death and the defeat of the Frisians, 734, also brought a formal end to Frisian paganism. At this point, Charles Martel ordered pagan shrines and sanctuaries to be destroyed, right? And this was accompanied with massive expoliations. In fact, Latin Chronicle says magna spoliat preta were taken from the land, because these shrines and sanctuaries were not very differently, if not by scale, loaded in wealth, in riches, just like the monasteries and churches of the Christians, because also around these holy places there was all kind of a cultic idea of the ancient religious military tradition, probably where also the leaders shared their loot, they sacrificed the prisoners to the gods, all these things. And so they were properly the living symbol, spiritually speaking, of the Frisian resistance, of their pagan background. At this point, the Carolingians annexed the Frisian lands between the Vlie and the Lauwers rivers, and a new phase of Christian conversion occurred. In the years 752-53, Boniface, missionary Boniface, wrote a letter to Pope Stephen II by saying that Willibrord destroyed these pagan sanctuaries and temples. And there are other legends, such as, for example, the one in the life written by Alcuin, that there are about Willibrord and pagan places of worship. We find that the missionary arrived at some point with his companions at Valkeren in the Netherlands, and there destroyed a sculpture of the ancient religion. While in the other account, Willibrord arrived on an island known in the sources Fositas land, which is possibly Heligoland, right? And that took the name after the Norse god Fositen that was worshipped there. And Fosite was a kind of an equivalent of the Roman Concordia, right? It was the god of justice and reconciliation, etc. And here the sanctuary was transformed as the Christian missionaries used the god's sacred well for baptizing the local population, and the sacred cattle was butchered for food, which is a powerful image because it struck at, again, a god that was trying some form of reconciliation in general and justice, etc. And so showing that the evangelization wouldn't accept any compromise. So there was a general emboldening of the Christian missionaries following the Frankish subjugation of Frisia, because naturally at this point the Carolingians were masters of the land, who had importantly occupied the area, etc. But this doesn't mean that the Frisians were just would become meek and docile from a day to another, right? And in fact, here Boniface, famously enough, would find his death. He was essentially baptizing a great number of Frisians at the time, and he summoned a general meeting for confirmation at a place not far from Dokkum, between Franeker and Groningen. And at this point, instead, then the neophytes, a group of armed men showed up. Right, these were Frisian warriors that were terribly angered by the Christian destruction of their own of their own shrines, and thus they massacred Boniface. And the anecdote goes that they thought that in Boniface chests that were brought together, on carriage together with the missionaries, there was gold, thinking that this whole thing would have gotten down to, how important gold is in the Norse Germanic mythology. There is all the purity, the first age connected to it, and there is always this kind of already the Romans hinted at this obsession of the barbarians for gold, because they thought they could treasure it, of course, in ways that would make them gain some further heavenly power. And instead, the Frisians found in Boniface's chests just Christian books that they destroyed in the process. So it's an interesting anecdote. Then this is come from a geography, but this shows also properly the lack, say, the cultural incommunicability at some point of understanding what this is for. If this is not for gold, what is this for? In a way, it was, because of course the church would have become powerful in the land, but the message goes beyond that, and so those books, in a sense, represent the books destruction is not really a good idea ever, but it was, again, the reaction of a people that had other mental structures and another background, had not encountered yet that meaning properly. Anyhow, order was gradually brought to the land. Things would have gotten heated up only 2 generations later, under Charlemagne, while he was still king of the Franks. He essentially waged war against the Frisians east of the Lauwers River, so we're talking about the eastern part of Frisia, with a large army. These were kind of the wilder areas of the land, were kind of also simply more in contact with the Saxons, also with Scandinavians that were already giving signs, let's say, of interest, in their raiding activities in the North Sea, and Charlemagne defeated the locals in several clashes, and so this actually brought to a complete end of Frisian independence, because at least those lands in part had, even though they were the least powerful, as we've seen, southern Frisia was the richest place, the one, in fact, in which kingship, some course, would develop, the Roman fortifications, the mouth of the Rhine, right? Some important trade happening there. These areas were kind of more unruly, but also less dangerous in a sense. But they would have had to be brought down also, in fact, in the wake of the Saxon Wars, because it was important to secure the supply routes for the army, not to have troubles with them. And in fact, Charlemagne was correct, as in 722 the Frisians east of the Lauwers joined Widokind's uprising in Saxony, and this revolt actually spread to the rest of the Frisian lands, right? Also in the southwest, as we've seen, had been pacified earlier, and so there was yet again an expulsion of the Christians. Churches were burnt down, priests had to flee the Frankish core land, showing how this was always the thing, like why again the Romans failed in Germany or in Scotland. It's not that they couldn't bring the people, they couldn't defeat the people militarily. It's just that on the long run they still wouldn't be assimilated. So the Frisians are, in a sense, with the Carolingians still the thing. The Carolingians were, as you know, were not tender souls, right? They were all about iron and blood. That's what the entirety of their culture, together with the mystical exaltation of the celestial military glory, and believing they were the chosen people, like the next Jews and the next Romans, would bring them to literally conquer the world. They were making a dramatically violent and systematic subjugation of effective peoples that, not even the Romans had historically been managed to bring down. Of course, some time had passed, and kind of Germany, already under the Merovingians, had been kind of colonized and kind of more gradually civilized. And to be civilized by the Franks is already makes you understand in comparison also how it was really further east. The Carolingians, as you know, would succeed completely with Saxony, right? They unified Germany for good, so much that the same empire would be revived, the Roman Christian one, from Saxony itself in the 10th century. So it was important to simply hammer down these people at all costs, and surely the Franks were not impressed by bloodshed. The Carolingians conquered again the area east of the Lauwers River in 785, essentially just after Charlemagne had defeated Widukind. First they settled matters in Saxony, then they went to eastern Frisia, and they kind of laid it waste again. At that point, Frisia was brought under the equivalent of a count or graf, the Grevan, in the local language, and that this some people have suggested that it means simply like a more civil, formal title and function than the one of personal possession / feudal overlordship that the Carolingians had built their own power on, as traditionally also the Merovingians had done. This is debatable, frankly, right? It's rather than, especially frankly, right? Because the Franks, probably, of course, were aware of the fact that they didn't need to oppress too much, right? But, wanted to see in the semantics of this title some kind of, leniency, or kind of, okay, you're just not like our possession. It's possible, but the power balance corresponded to other dynamics, believe me. So much, in fact, that Charlemagne crushed the Frisian revolt. The Frisians revolted again, though, in 793. They really couldn't take it. And this time, the reason, however, being that the Frisians had been forced into conscription to the Frankish army to go fight against the other Khaganate. So essentially from the other side of the empire, something that, of course, from a local perspective was not really understood in the bigger plans of the Carolingian Empire from a Frisian perspective, and that also speaks, of the scale of, civilizational difference. As you know, the Franks made intensive use of all the subjected peoples also from a military point of view. They drew both the elites and the militias from, especially in this major operations that entailed a lot of, that necessitated a lot of field aids for the logistics. The other Khaganate invasion of the Danube was a massive thing, second only to the double column that crossed the Alps into Longobard Italy, crushing the Longobard blocks at the end of the valleys, of the Alpine valleys. And so this revolt shows at least that the Frisians had at least entered in the mindset that, as they had provided some contingents of their own already to the Carolingians, that they were within that system. And this revolt was led by the Dukes Unno and Eilrad. And yet again, the revolt rose east of the Lauwers River and spread to the other Frisian lands. Now, this is interesting because it's almost as if there had been a Frisian Neustria and Austrasia paralleling the events of the Frankish war, right? The Western one having kind of softened up more, even though it was the richest and most prosperous, and the Eastern one tougher and kind of more political and military cohese, even though more primitive, right? And the same story, like, the Carolingians came from Austrasia to Gaul. It was effectively the Frankish heartland of power. Except, even though it was yet again a temporary return of paganism, priests had to flee, etc. Charlemagne suppressed this revolt once again, right? Charlemagne was a quite energetic, enormous organizer, a logistician, right? We just don't have enough evidence also for considering the level of development of the military art of the time properly to assess whether he was a military genius or anything, but he was a man of an enormous moral stature that was literally keeping together, right? Taking on his shoulders the whole freaking empire is something man's clamors, and that's why really one of the key figures in the history of mankind. And Frisia was brought down, importantly, so to the point that Charlemagne also issued the Lex Frisionum. So as for other peoples that they had brought down, he introduced this code, this legal code, to essentially control the local population. He defined better, especially in the penal code, what was the social stratification, right? Also where we get the thing of the noblemen, the freemen, the serfs, and the slaves, because the Franks, as you know, was essentially bringing in through their vassalic beneficiary system as a proto-feudalism, where the social roles and hierarchies had to be ever better defined. Also because literally the establishment that they had introduced there was based on that order. So it was a mean of social control as well, as much as the spread of Christian administration. The same, famously enough, with Saxony. There's a beautiful documentation of that. Also, probably the priests used as spies, as controlling what. It was not even about people. Of course, they couldn't really change the people mindset. I mean, paganism, as we explained, it's like a modernistic and a secularistic delusion to pretend that it was such a thing like paganism in Christianity as two categorically opposed things, right? It was just a political and social struggle that took the form of certain ideologies as a sort of banners, but the mentality, don't think that the Franks were, aware of Christian theology in any consistent terms, right? Especially as far as the secular elite was concerned, Charlemagne made an enormous reform of the clergy as well, because literally they couldn't even read Latin. I mean, we are at this level. So the pagan mindset was like, we still have it simply because the same Christianity is coming from the same universal background. Like, it's not that it copied it; it was the same place where it was formed and existed, right? So unfortunately, making these things clear today is almost impossible with people that still think in kind of it's as if there was an ethno-nationalist religious affiliation to the idea. I'm a pagan because I'm against even, I don't know, certain other people. That you haven't understood anything about history. You haven't, as a matter of fact, not understood anything about paganism. If you actually, look at what even neo-paganism is about, it's basically zero of any awareness of the actual past. It's pure materialism and modernism and secularism, right? Unfortunately, this is a historical problem. We don't teach history. We don't explain, especially history of religion, right? We don't form people's minds to understand such things, and it's terrifying, right? So at this point, you would think it would be over. Yeah, for the Frisians in a sense, but this was also, in fact, the Viking era starting, and the Frisians, as we've seen, had been part of an important trade circuit that had much in common with Scandinavia, but also with Anglo-Saxon England. So there was an unavoidable interest overseas in the Frisian coastline, even just as a logistical base, and in fact as an opportunity to control the Rhine mouth, so much that in 810 the Danish king Gottfried led a fleet consisting of 200 ships, so it's said at least, to invade Frisia, right? So to claim it as part of his Danish realm, right? To be part of the Danish realm. And however, these initiatives were kind of ill-fated in a sense. Gottfried was killed by his own men, and his fleet withdrew to the Jutland back before it came actually to any significant clash with the Frankish army in the first place. So these were kind of some bravados and shows off. And this is interesting because Gottfried was also Gottfried's sister was one of Charlemagne's concubines. And there were an important connection. In fact, also the relation between the Franks and the Danes is an interesting one. It's often misunderstood in a kind of a sort of positional way, but the truth is that actually Denmark was dramatically benefiting also in that matters of hostility and fear of Frankish invasion would actually occur, especially under Radbod. Think about the Dannevirke and all this stuff, to be part kind of that power, to coalesce into, in fact, the strongest of the Scandinavian monarchies historically, because of greater proximity to civilization, to, let's say, obvious, kind of also greater pressure, in fact, from the continental neighbors that brought necessarily to a greater effort in building up something stately, looking at least. But the Vikings were not done with Frisia. In fact, Rorik of Dorestad, that is this Scandinavian pirate who is also associated very often with the Rorik of the Kievan Rus, because at some point, exactly after this, this Frisian adventure, he appears. There is at least the other historical figure of he disappears from the area, and there's the other historical figure appearing instead in the Rus. Makes us think that they are the same people, in fact, the same person. I mean, in any case, Frisia was controlled, in fact, by the Danes between 841 and 880, right? And there was also another Viking, Danish Viking, Gottfried, that was in fact Duke of Frisia at some point. It was some kind of share also there of coexistence, this sharing of power with the Franks by a certain degree. He was killed in 885 though. So, and after that, kind of the Frankish establishment, or at least what remained of that, came back in control with Gerulf of Holland, right, who is credited, even though we miss some chains, some rings in the chain, as with probably the dynasty of the Counts of Holland that would remain in the Middle Ages in the area. So these were local post-Carolingian powers who retook control of Frisia after the Viking wave. And yeah, there was broader continuity eventually with that policy, but let's say maybe we will see that on another video. This was probably about the so-called kingdom. Again, excessive term as we've seen, but still, this policy, this Frisian policy that tried, right, had its own shot, and had to encumbering neighbors to emerge, probably, and that, however, it doesn't have to be overlooked, because in the broader Carolingian balance of power, the Frisians were not this great threat. But when you have to manage an entire empire where everybody rebels at the outskirts, etc., and you have to run back and forth as Charlemagne, his successor, did, to keep the thing together, let's say I think it's important to appreciate, how disgregative, such movements can be, and how therefore how much, what a thorn in the side, not to say else, this really was, to maintain control with all these nuisances. But for today, stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.